for women, and of course, success stories along with tips for starting a podcast. Lots of really fun topics. So some of the objectives include exploring the technological and educational barriers to podcasting faced by African women, to share the success stories of African podcasters, and to analyze and discuss how podcasting can be used as a tool for empowerment for journalists. And we're hoping outcomes include a new understanding of the podcasting landscape and strategies on.
Can everyone mute their mics, please?
Yes, please. Okay, thank you, Kim. So some of the outcomes include a new understanding of the podcasting landscape in Africa and strategies on using podcasting as a tool for empowerment. So I'm gonna go ahead now. Before we get started, I'm just gonna introduce each panelist. So first, we have Professor Kim Fox. Kim is a professor of practice in the Department of Journalism at AUC. She's one of my colleagues. And one of my research partners as well. She's the executive producer of the award-winning Ihki Ya Masr, Tell Your Story Egypt podcast about life in Cairo. Additionally, her students have won numerous international audio awards since 2010. In March 2020, Kim executed along with her team Podfest Cairo and Africa's first podcasting conference. One of her areas of scholarly research is podcasting, including recent publications like A Curriculum for Blackness, podcasts as Discursive Cultural Guides, 2010 to 2020, and African Podcasting Challenges and Chances. So Kim is going to be our first presenter. And then following Kim is Dr. Jasmine Jones. Dr. Jones is a dynamic theater nonprofit leader, award-winning educator, and got her PhD in education and African studies from the University of Pennsylvania. Her research on performance as a civic engagement praxis illuminates global race-based inequities in education and health, lifting the potential of knowledge co-creation through Black digital cultural production. Having 20 plus years of leadership in arts and advocacy within the global Africa community, in 2018, Dr. Jones extended the scope of B4YT to include a consulting practice, creating Brave Stages, which provides guidance and support for efforts to realize Black liberation as an Afrofuturist practice. And also Dr. Jones is currently a postdoctoral fellow in racism, immigration and citizenship at Johns Hopkins University. And following Dr. Jones's presentation is Melissa Mbugua. And Melissa, please correct me if I mispronounced your last name. My apologies if I did. So Melissa is a creative problem solver committed to broadening African cultural and economic space for future generations. She is an entrepreneur, researcher, innovator, and artist, and has worked with some of the most innovative technology and culture companies in Africa. Her work has involved seeding civic technology innovation in Africa and Asia, accelerating creative and cultural industries in Africa, and catalyzing the next generation of media companies that create free spaces for expression and collaboration towards a sustainable economic and social system. All right, and then following Melissa is Jedi Ramalapa, who is the editor-in-chief of Sound Africa podcast. So Jedi is a South Africa-based multimedia journalist and media trainer. Recently, she worked in Juba, South Sudan for Canada's largest international media development organization, Journalists for Human Rights, JHR. She is currently editor-in-chief of Sound Africa, a nonprofit nonfiction audio documentary organization with a mission to produce African stories which advance social justice and amplify the voices of everyday people. Sound Africa's most recent podcast exploring the challenge of xenophobia in South Africa, One Night in Snake Park. And it was listed as 100 Outstanding Nonfiction Podcasts of 2020 by the Bellow Collective. So we have, as you guys could see, we have a list of really fantastic speakers. And last is Msia Kibona Clark, who is an associate professor at Howard University. Dr. Clark is an associate professor in the Department of African Studies. Her work focuses on African identities and feminisms in hip hop culture. Her work also explores African women's use of cyber activism in digital and social media. Her research has produced a lot of scholarship on hip hop in Africa and Black transnationalism. Msia is also a photographer and podcaster. She hosts the Hip Hop African blog and podcast, which contains over 1,000 posts on hip hop culture in Africa. The Hip Hop African podcast features conversations with artists, activists, and scholars from across the continent. So that is the introduction for all of our fantastic panelists. And lastly, just so everyone is aware of what we are doing today, what's on the agenda. So each panelist is going to present their topic for 10 minutes. So it's going to take approximately 50 to 55 minutes. And then following that, we're going to have a moderator-led discussion, approximately 30 minutes. And then we're going to have the audience Q&A, and then we're going to follow that with our final remarks. So does anybody have any questions so far? We good?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, great. So we are going to start, okay, in the order of how I introduce all the panelists. So Kim, you are going to be our first presenter. So I'm just going to end the share screening here really quickly so you can take the lead.
Okay, great.
Stop share. Okay, perfect. All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Let's get this in presentation mode so you don't see as many tabs. My name is Kim Fox. I'm with the American University in Cairo, Egypt. I've been living in Egypt for the past few years, since 2009. And even though I'm not fully Egyptian, I'm certainly embracing the culture here. I'm going to give a bit of a preview on my involvement with podcasting in Egypt since my arrival in 2009. And I'm also going to mention the female-led projects that I've been working on while I've been here in Egypt. And my apology, like I normally do my presentations from home. This is the first time I'm doing a presentation from my office, and it's a really unique situation here today. We have a sandstorm for one, and it's the next to the last day of classes, and there's just a lot of activity in the office today. So I do have several topics that I wanted to highlight, one of them being Podfest Cairo, another being a project that I've been working on called the Eki Amasr podcast, as Yasmeen mentioned in the beginning. And recently, Yasmeen and I have been working on a research project, and I want to discuss that as well. It's about Egyptian female podcasters. So first, I'm going to talk about Podfest Cairo. This has been my baby, and I'm really excited and energetic about it. It was an idea that came to my mind several years ago because I had attended several Podfests and different kinds of podcasting conferences. And it just kind of dawned on me, like, why aren't we doing that here in Egypt? And like many of my ideas, I kind of waited for someone else to do it. And that didn't happen. And so I said, look, I have some resources I can take advantage of. So let me see if I can assemble something. Thankfully, I do have a university that has a lot of resources for conferences, especially in regards to innovation and technology. So I was able to get funding from my university to execute the first Podfest Cairo in March of 2020. That funding really took advantage of us having a keynote speaker. So we were able to invite Hannah Alam from the US. She was working at the National Public Radio at the time, NPR. And so we were supposed to pay her an honorarium, but NPR journalists are unable to accept honorariums. So we did have funding for that, plus flying her in and putting her up at a hotel for a few days. So that kind of funding is really instrumental when you're trying to expose the podcasting community, to some of the bigger names and to share those resources. And Hannah is Egyptian, so that was also a really good fit for us, that she was able to come and talk about her experiences from a US perspective, but she also had been a journalist in Egypt. We also had some other activities for the first Podfest, including a competition where we were looking for a new podcaster. But most importantly, it was pretty much a female-led team. And I thought that was key. A lot of my former students have a real sharp interest in podcasting and cultivating this community here in the Cairo area. And so I was able to enlist their assistance, not just in the planning perspective, but also in terms of the content. So a lot of my former students were the speakers because they work in radio and audio media. Our master of ceremonies is also just very well known in the community. So she was able to give us a high profile exposure just because she's very well known, Nadine El Gadawi. And so, yeah, that's it about Podfest Cairo. Earlier this year, we were virtual, but thankfully we're coming back face to face for March 2020. We have our date set aside. I think it's March 4 or 5. And we're really looking forward to a two-day festival and not just a couple of hours. So I'm looking forward to that again with our mostly female-led team. Next, I want to talk about the Ekiamasa podcast. We are currently in production. I am the executive producer of the podcast. I'm laughing because I have a piece that's launching on Sunday. And yeah, I'm supposed to be tracking it in a few minutes. So it's a really, really hectic time. Like, who told me to put together a podcast during the last week of the semester? Not the best idea in terms of timing. But the podcast is a narrative nonfiction podcast about life in Egypt. We have a lot of fun with it. We play around with these different themes. Our current theme is food, and we're giving you history and conversations about different kinds of food in Cairo and in Egypt. So the storytelling format is, it's a slow cook. Most of you already know that it's not an interview podcast, and it just takes a little bit more time. Technically, it takes us about 3 to 4 months to put together our series because it just takes a lot of time to identify the topics, find the interviews, write the scripts, get the nat sounds and the music. It's just a bit of a longer process, and I have a full-time job. So we managed to get it done, but it usually takes us a while. And again, it's a female-led team. Actually, for this current food series that we're currently in, we had our first male piece in this series. So this is our 5th series, and it's the first time we have a guy in our series. So we really welcome Calvin Harrison to the team. And he was also helping out with Podfest Cairo. But generally speaking, I started the Ekiamasa podcast because the female students in my classes who had won awards for their student work were asking for more opportunities to do audio. So myself and Noor Sadiq, one of the producers, came up with the idea for the Ekiamasa podcast, Tell Your Story Egypt. And again, I was looking for funding, didn't find the funding, and just said, hey, let's do this. And so all of them are pretty much volunteering their time to tell the stories that they're really passionate about. The last thing I want to talk about is a project that Yasmeen and I are working on together, the Egyptian female podcasters shaping feminist identities. And again, this goes back to something from my work in the classroom. It took me several years to realize a theme in some of my female students' podcasts. Again, we've been producing these and posting them online since 2009. And the theme, it shouldn't be a surprise to some people, is feminism. And so what I finally decided to do was try to evaluate and analyze some of the content in these podcasts. So what Yasmeen and I did was we pretty much did a case study approach, so qualitative, and we looked at 4 podcasters and their podcasts, and we also interviewed them about the podcast that they produced when they were students. There was a considerable lapse in time. So for them to go back and reflect on that time was really refreshing for all of us to kind of look at their former selves and how much they've evolved and if they were thinking of feminism at that time. All of these podcasts are available online. I can share them in the chat after my presentation, but they do have feminist themes, and I think you would find it really interesting what we've discovered in the research. And we're also pretty excited to share that we recently had this research project accepted in a Q1 journal, Learning Media and Technology, and we're hoping to see it come out in the next few months. You know how publishing has also a slow cook. So as I wrap up, just a few more things about the feminism research project. We're looking at digital feminism. We're exploring not just the various feminist epistemologies, but we're also looking at identities of our female podcasters. We also embedded in the active and authentic learning theories, just to give it the pedagogy that goes along with that. And it's a bit of feminist pedagogy as well. That's all I have for now. So if you want to find me on the socials, this is where you can find me. And I'm hoping to get some questions from you all as we wrap up. But thank you for your time. And I'm really excited to hear from the other presenters today.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you. That was very informative. Thank you. Okay, so our next presenter is Dr. Jones. Yes. So whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon and good morning and good evening, wherever you may be. I'm very excited to be here with you all and to participate in this amazing panel with some phenomenal speakers. I'll be presenting about the AI for Africa podcast, where I serve as curator. This particular presentation falls in line with the third outcome that was shared in the opening comments around how to use podcasting for empowerment. Briefly, AI for Africa is a collective or an alliance between Africa and the diaspora to address technology and advancement for the global Africa, Black people, wherever they may be. So we address policy and theory across a range of topics from agriculture to art, and our work is action-oriented. Our collective is formed of data scientists, artists, educationists, ethnomusicologists, attorneys, medical doctors, choreographers, angel investors, entrepreneurs, students, filmmakers, data architects, and so much more. Here are some of our founders. I know that Dr. Jackie Berry's over there with you, Kim. So she is definitely an advocate for this transnational type of work that lifts global Africa. Before I jump into the podcast itself, I do want to acknowledge Anatola Areba, who is our producer of the AI for Africa podcast. She and I work very closely together as I do the curation for the podcast, but she makes sure that the aesthetics and that the logistics of putting on the actual shows or the productions go ahead in a way that's clean and that's efficient and really effective. And Alex Sato is the media director for AI for Africa. We work closely with him as well, but the podcasting is Anatola and I's project. So as a form of public scholarship, we use this podcast to support AI for Africa's missions of eradicating tech exclusion and the harm it causes, to accelerate or incubate ideas to bring about Black and global prosperity, to repair public perception of Black people, and to bring Black cultural values into the practice of technology. So AI for Africa is artificial intelligence in particular. That's what we look at. And we don't only think of artificial intelligence through the traditional lens of technology, we also consider AI as authentic intelligence and what we might learn and think and understand through the connections between the body and the mind, a very Africanist and feminist way of addressing the construction of knowledge and knowledge production. So our first podcast series was Human 2121, Reimagining the Future of Humans. This was an idea brought to us by one of our members, Kishal Rogers, and it was a chance for us to reach out and connect with other AI-focused individuals in different parts of the world who were members of our collective, but also some who weren't, and to have a really robust discussion on what humanity means, is, and will look like 100 years from now. Part of this series continued to focus on education and reimagining pedagogy, practice. In 100 years, will school be in a building? What have we learned during COVID-19 about the possibilities for creating more equity, for sharing different kinds of knowledge, different forms of knowledge across different national borders and boundaries? At the same time, what were some of the hindrances that continue to perpetuate cycles of disparities for those who don't have as much access to tech? We had a session on embodied arts. 100 years from now, what is the role of the body? How do we understand the body as a site of knowledge production, of creation, and what does that mean in a world that is quickly advancing towards disembodied forms through avatars and the metaverse and all of these potentially artificial ways of engaging in intelligence, but we are here to really insert the idea of authenticity and of bringing a fuller personhood into the tech world that recognizes African perspectives. In Capital 2121, we got right down to the heart of the matter that resources and extraction and the way capital flows globally is and will probably continue to be a major issue 100 years from now. What are the visions and possibilities of reimagining the future of capital? And then we took a turn, we took a break from that original series on Human 2121, and we featured one of our scholars, Dr. Funmi Arewa, who has a brilliant book called Disrupting Africa, where she looks at beyond disruptive tech or disruptive innovations. She looks at the concept of disruption as something that has constantly been born by people of African descent and in Africa. Our systems are disrupted, our ways of living and being together are disrupted through colonialism and other ghosts of colonialism is the term that she uses. So we got to do an in-depth dive with her as a break between our sessions, and we're gearing up for what is to come. I will not play this snippet of Capital 2121, mostly because when I hit share screen, I didn't share the sound. But all of the podcasts are available on Apple and Spotify and on our partner site, Hosted in Africa, which is hosted in Africa. Femi, who was in one of the photos earlier, runs a phenomenal platform, and we work with him so that we own our data, we own the ways that information is tracked about our podcast and about our work in general. And we know that we have a safe space that where we can continue to have these discussions. Speaking of continuing the discussions beyond the actual podcast, oh, it is, I'm gonna skip that. We pair our podcast with Clubhouse discussions. So we'll have the podcast recorded and then we'll set a date 2 or 3 days later to do a podcast discussion on our own channel. But we've also been joining other channels as well and having duplicate discussions with different groups of people to really expand our network. All of this to say that this podcast really does serve as our primary media outlet for AI for Africa. It gives us a chance to lift our issues with a variety of groups of people that are representative of some of the members that we have in terms of different disciplines and different areas of focus. But at the same time, it allows us to really carve out a space for what it is we're doing in terms of inserting African perspectives into AI and disruptive tech that's different from the way some others are doing it, beyond just an equity framework, beyond just casually throwing out the term justice, really thinking about the nexus between theory and practice and truly taking action to advance a better world for global Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Fantastic presentation, and I am so excited to listen to the podcast. Okay, next we have Melissa. So whenever you are ready, you can go ahead and get started.
Hi, everyone. I am Melissa, co-founder and co-director of Africa Podfest, based out of Nairobi. And Africa Podfest is a company that's 2 years old, which really came out of recognition of podcasting as an opportunity to center voices that are in the margins, like women's voices, queer communities, people with disability in Africa who don't often see ourselves represented in the media universe. And so my co-founder and I, as practitioners in media and arts and culture and technology, decided to come at this challenge of bringing together pioneers in the podcast space to innovate, to collaborate, to exchange, so that we could catalyze this process of building what could then become a more inclusive audio industry for Africa. And so what we do is we we host an annual gathering, global gathering on Africa Podcast Day, which is in February every year. We also, during the year, in between the annual event, convene gatherings in country and with local podcast pioneers in various countries. We are big fans of Kim's work with Podfest Cairo and with all the other projects that Kim does. And so we try to connect with leaders, with community conveners, with innovators in different parts of the continent. We also carry out original research to try and bridge this gap for so many people who are in the podcast space, whether as creators or whether as potential investors, whether as academics, researchers who are trying to get closer to understanding what the opportunity is, but there's such a lack of data. So we celebrate African podcasters, and we recognize and are very excited about the fact that more than ever before, African voices are taking control of our own narrative and of our own stories. And for us, the dream is to see an industry, an audio industry in Africa that's thriving with fresh narratives, fresh African narratives at the center. So we recently released a report just last week where we were talking to podcasters and as well as we studied some of the data that we've been able to collect over the past year, exploring how podcasting is taking root across Africa. It's accessible at this website, and I'm going to share just quickly some of the key findings. So we conducted a literature review. We talked to about 11 podcasters from different countries, and we analyzed data from a crowdsourced database of podcasts, from a podcast incubator in Kenya that focuses on women podcasters, as well as an audience survey. And so the findings are very interesting because, one, podcasters are driven by a sense of community, autonomy, and for the space, the opportunity for free expression and representation that podcasting brings. And this cuts across all the podcasters that we spoke to. And the barriers that podcasters face are resources to grow and infrastructure. The locations, most audiences of African podcasts are in Africa, even though quite a significant and growing proportion are in the diaspora. So what we found that was quite interesting and kind of and does challenge in a big way the conventional wisdom in media, at least in East Africa, is that one, the most podcast audiences and podcasters are women. And this, we are very interested in investigating this further because this was our first report and of phase one of this project, and we intend to continue this in 2022. So women are a confident majority, even though the audience is more or less, it looks balanced, but women are leading. The age, the demographic is 25 to 35 years old. And then with the themes, we were surprised here because typically in media, in East Africa and in many countries in Africa as well, the top themes in media that media makers deliver tend to be politically themed or like entertainment, sports, which are popular themes. But then what we found is that the growth in podcasts in terms of what the audiences are gravitating towards, the most popular themes among audiences are in the self-help theme, culture and arts, business and leadership, and then entertainment. So that pie is upside down, compared to the conventional wisdom in the industry. And we think that's interesting and points to some interesting questions about how podcasting is changing the shape of media. We also analyzed the language of podcasting in Africa, and we found that so far, even though majority of the podcasts are in English, there's quite a bubbling under of different African languages. And this is also interesting to see how it develops, year on year. And especially we're looking to gather more data from even more countries and see exactly how the languages are developing in the podcast space. And so what we found that's really exciting for us and for women in media and for the audience in this room is that the opportunities in African podcasting are quite massive because majority of African voices are underrepresented in the media. So women, for example, women, youth, children, people with disabilities. So there's so much that can be done. There's so much space to create what doesn't exist at present. Also, the audience is huge and hungry for fresh voices, not least in terms of language. So for example, if you make a Swahili podcast, you'd be reaching potentially an audience of 100 million across Eastern Africa, which is unaddressed. Further, and like I mentioned, we also are hoping to conduct further research and in collaboration with partners who are also interested in going further into exploring exactly how podcasting is currently impacting audiences, but also what its potential is for including underrepresented voices. And that's my presentation. I'm looking forward to chatting more about it afterwards.
Thank you, Melissa. Lots of eye-opening insights. Thank you. Okay, so now we have Jidi. So whenever you are ready, you can start.
Okay, thank you very much, Yasmeen. Sorry to keep everybody waiting. I was trying to find my unmute button here on my screen. Yeah, as Yasmeen said earlier, my name is JD Ramalapa. I am a journalist based in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I'm here representing Sound Africa as its editor-in-chief. I guess we are all very much aware of the fact that there is a storytelling revolution that is underway, and we are hearing stories that are coming from everywhere in the world. People are all publishers, and now we are all kind of in this space in time where we are reimagining narratives and hearing voices from the margins, and nowhere is this happening or this storytelling evolution, nor is it more evident than in the digital audio space, which is what podcasts are. And if you just do a quick search on the internet, you will see there are over 2 million podcasts across the world. 48 million of them have been created since April. And the Apple podcast app reports that they have over 1 billion subscribers to their shows. As you can see that the industry is exploding, and there is also very much a large room for growth on the African continent, because it is currently still concentrated in the southern, west, and east and north Africa. So even though Africa is still catching up, there are really a lot of podcasts that are coming out. I am actually quite fortunate to belong to a group of African women podcasters who are really doing well and really sort of are the trailblazers in this industry and are doing really great work. So because the podcasting space can be so isolating and alone, this group has been really helpful in providing support as a platform for skills sharing for women who are doing podcasts. I am coming from South Africa, and in the South African context, the podcasting space is still very much largely dominated by white and male figures. And so And I just joined Sound Africa, let's say in 2020, and to lead it, taking over from two male founders. And so even though it is a mostly male-dominated industry in South Africa, there are really a lot of women who are podcasting all the time. It's just that we don't often get to hear about the podcasts or see them. As Melissa just said, the podcasting space is largely in Africa, the podcasts that are coming out are largely talk, interview shows. One of the famous ones here in South Africa is Podcast and Chill, and there are others in other areas, but they're mostly talk show or interview shows. And so we even though there are more narratives are popping up, because they require so much investment in money. They're often produced by established media organizations. So research by the Africa Media Initiative conducted in 2018 found that Africans still rely very largely on foreign media as their main credible source of news about the continent. And in their research, they found that most media houses on the continent are very much inward looking, and they report a lot on national events, and there's very limited cross-border reporting between African states, and that's largely because of resources and capacity, and also the types of governments that are there. But we feel that this is a gap that Sound Africa can occupy, where it could actually be a platform where African journalists and storytellers can produce and showcase their work. Sound Africa has been around for 5 years. It was first established in 2015. And since then, we have been able to produce over 40 long-form documentary podcasts that are listened to in over 50 countries across the world. So far, we've had over 327,000 downloads. And, we stand to be corrected, but we pride ourselves as being one of the first African documentary podcasts to come out. A lot of our work is really nonfiction, narrative, audio-based. So we don't have a lot of these talk show style show. We don't have the talk show interview style podcasts. And we're free to download, and we're available on SoundCloud and wherever else you listen to your podcast. So Sound Africa was really created with the belief that the African continent has beautiful stories to tell, and we've wanted to tell those stories in a way that represents all the diverse voices and narrative styles of producers in our continent. In the past 5 years, we've had the opportunity to really collaborate and partner with some very credible local and international partners in producing stories. Excuse me. Some of our podcasts have been carried on the BBC Africa Radio 4, Kaya FM, and more recently, we've partnered with Ruben FM in Kenya, and Ruben FM in Kenya and Radio Mariah in South Sudan, who are carrying podcasts COVID in Africa and Think African, respectively. So as a podcasting platform or organizations, we really have big goals that are anchored by a strong vision to really build a network of independent, world-class and Afrocentric narrative podcasts with a global audience. Our aim is to really produce and publish and provide resources for independent podcast producers across Africa. But more concretely, we'd like to have to establish three podcasts, to have three established podcasts and a few others on the pipeline, and also employ more people to work with us. And just like Melissa mentioned, also try and have some of our podcasts produced in languages spoken in Africa or translated into them. In the past 2 years, we've had a lot of opportunities to conduct workshop courses, and some of our students have also published really successful podcasts this year. We have basically our team, the management structure of Sound Africa is meant to be pretty much agile, simple, and transparent. And the South African board is the highest level of decision-making body in the organization. And they meet twice a year, and they just really oversee the management of the organization and making sure that we are following on the vision. So what's next for us? More podcasts, hopefully, but in order to produce them, we need a lot of funding because a lot of research and reporting goes into producing narrative podcasts. And for us to be able to do that comfortably, we would need like over 1.6 billion or 100,000 US dollars a year. And we'd use that money really to continue to produce African stories that advance social justice along the themes of environment, the economy, the social political culture, and COVID-19, themes that we think will be really important for the continent looking forward from a journalistic and public interest perspective. So eventually our dream really is to turn part of our business into a paid subscription service, and then which would then contribute to the self-sustaining revenue model, which currently includes podcast hosting, production, and training. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to further discussions.
Thank you, Jidi. So much insightful information from everyone. This is so exciting. Thank you. Okay, so our last presenter is Msia. Yes, so whenever you are ready, Msia, you can go ahead.
Thank you. So I, want to, my kind of journey to podcasting is slightly different. And so I kind of started podcasting as an extension of my scholarship. I initially, I've always been a fan of podcasts, but I initially assigned doing a podcast to my students. Got really tired of reading 5-page papers and just needed something different. And so I saw online that there were some academics that had tried assigning podcast assignments. And so I assigned a podcast as an assignment in my hip hop in Africa class. And it was, fairly successful, but then I realized I, could do this. And I had always thought that many of the interesting conversations that I've had with artists because of my own research and through, doing research for articles and books and so forth, I'd always thought these are really fascinating conversations. I'm only using aspects of it for this article or for this research. And so the idea kind of to do podcasts also stemmed from that, wanting to have those conversations on another platform, wanting to really share those conversations. And so I watched a lot of tutorials because I'm not at all trained in media. So I'm a photographer, but have never kind of been trained in any other form of media and didn't have a team. had a couple student assistants, but never had a team. And so watched a lot of tutorials and decided to go for it. I still have a hard time listening to probably the first 10 episodes because of the quality. But, we're now on episode 74. And the first episode was released in October 2016. And, like the previous presenters have said, there has been a significant increase of African women in podcasting. And so it's been really exciting for me to kind of be a fan of the new podcasts that I've seen coming out over the years. Our audience is still primarily the US and South Africa, and various European countries come in. If we do an interview with a Ghanaian artist, we'll see an uptick in Ghanaian streams. If we do an interview with the Tanzanian artist, we see an uptick of streams from Tanzania. So, I've always kind of wanted to have in mind and really try to. We've reduced the size of the episodes, the length, because in the early days we were doing like 1 hour podcasts, and I realized that that's way too much. So we've tried to minimize it a bit. And I decided to stay with hip hop versus other pop music genres, really because of the nature of hip hop as social commentary, and really wanting to explore some of that social commentary, because we wanted the podcast to be different from other hip hop podcasts or music podcasts that are really kind of focusing on the artist style and really promoting the artist's, new releases or what have you. And we wanted it to focus on more serious conversations. So, I decided to stay with hip hop. And I've also kind of had a lot of experience in hip hop culture, being a part of hip hop culture. So that was also a reason. I mean, these are artists that I listen to. And so, in keeping the focus on social commentary, it has been interesting in terms of finding artists. There are a lot of artists from all over Africa that do great, amazing work. There have been only a couple times where we've done interviews with artists that were provocative, kind of controversial for various reasons. And in doing the interview, we realized that the person was being provocative for the sake of being provocative, and there wasn't kind of this awareness of the broader implications of it. It was more, this is what is cool, and so I'm going to do this and push boundaries. And so we just didn't use those interviews. So we did the interviews with the artists, but we decided not to use them because the artist really wasn't saying much by way of social commentary. And so we've been, kind of really serious about only focusing on those issues. And, sometimes artists who are not known for being socially conscious will be interviewed because their music does provoke conversations around language use. A lot of artists who are not socially or politically conscious, we've interviewed because, the way that they use language, the way they use African languages, or the way they themselves identify has been important. So one of the things I've also kind of addressed is the issue of women in hip hop. We've had a lot of women, over a dozen women, which is still not representative of the percentage of the population that women occupy. But when it comes to hip hop culture, the percentage of women in that community significantly diminishes. So hip hop is a very masculine space. It is a very hyper masculine space. It's a very misogynistic space. And so that can be problematic for women. And as a researcher, I've bumped into some of those problematic situations. And, there are a couple male artists who, because of their problematic behavior outside of the studio, we have kind of banned from the blog, from the podcast, so that they won't be interviewed, nor will any articles about them be featured on the blog. So that's one thing that I'm proud of kind of making sure that when we are aware of those things that we kind of take action. But I decided to intentionally include a lot of women's voices when I could, because one, I was inspired by a lot of those women as being a woman who has existed in hip hop culture. And so we've gotten women from all over Africa, and the episodes featuring women, but also some of the episodes featuring the men, have dealt with gender, sexuality, language, religion, gender-based violence, politics, democracy, just a whole host of issues. Because I also wanted to, stress that women don't only talk about gender, that the women are able to talk about a whole host of other issues or topics. So my lateness in putting together the podcast, a presentation, visual presentation. So I'm going to I just posted a link. So that is, I did a video, like a 2-minute video collage of some of the interviews I've had with artists and put it together in a post. So you're able to see, I think there are like 4 interviews there. Most of the women we've interviewed are from South Africa, primarily because South Africa has the largest number of active female artists in hip hop. So while, there are artists in other countries, South Africa may have, in terms of active, in terms of mainstream, acknowledgement, they may even have more than the US. I mean, South Africa is really, since 2010 or so, the number of women who have decided to get involved in hip hop culture has significantly grown. So many of our episodes are also streamed online by a hip hop radio station in South Africa, Beat Bangers Radio. They asked us, could we stream some of your episodes? So we put them in a shared drive and they're able to stream them. Our episodes were mostly, most of our audience listens to the audio version only. We only started doing video episodes really because of the pandemic and Zoom, and it made it really easy. Before, we were doing interviews on Skype and it just wasn't as friendly to doing video episodes. And so the shows are also used a lot by researchers, academics, as well as we found professors using them in the classroom. So we've got a lot of kind of links or traffic from university websites. And so, we're realizing that it's also being used as that tool. So in terms of future plans, really increasing production quality. Like I said, the first 10 episodes I still don't like listening to, but we've gotten better. Tutorials are helpful. And, the goal is to really do more episodes in other languages. So I'm Tanzanian, so we have Swahili episodes. So I have a few episodes that are in Swahili only. I have a few where I'm kind of doing rough translations of what the artists are saying. The work of a translator, I appreciate it so much when I started doing this, because to try to kind of really translate accurately what someone is saying can sometimes be difficult, especially when your Swahili is not the best. But we want to do episodes in other languages, and that would entail having folks who can do those episodes in other languages. So Arabic and French, and then some of the other African languages. And so to do some of that stuff, we definitely are looking for funding. The podcast is free to access and free of ads, and we were only able to do this because of student volunteers. So they're not, I shouldn't say volunteers, because they are getting paid from the university. So they're getting stipends from the university to help. So it's not that, they're just not, it's not completely volunteer work. But we need funding to do more things, like to do episodes in other countries. So having other people in other countries being able to do episodes in different languages would be great. I focus the show not on me. I very rarely say my name. I don't think I've ever really said my name on the show. And I think that's a habit from academia, because academia says you're never supposed to include yourself. You always say the research found that this is true, or the research says this, rather than I'm saying. And I think that habit has always made it difficult for me to kind of put my identity as an individual into the podcast. But it does make it easy to have other people do episodes, because the show doesn't necessarily revolve around me. And I also have a wish list of artists that I really want to interview. Every time someone asks, I always say Kanan, because I'm hoping if I put it out in the universe enough that he will somehow hear about it. Kanan is a very, for those who, I think a lot of us know, he did the 2010 World Cup anthem. Very prolific, important Somali artist who kind of disappeared because of the industry. And I really want to interview him. So he's one of the artists that I have on he's literally number one on my wish list. And so, but we've interviewed most of the artists that we wanted to interview. Most of the artists that were on my wish list, I have had a chance to interview. So people like Blitz the Ambassador and Manifest from Ghana, Dope St. Jude, who's an amazing queer artist from South Africa. We just did an interview, which was released yesterday, a Feed Q, a Tanzanian artist who's, fairly notable in Tanzania. So it's been great to interview the people and to kind of get to a point where we're able to go for artists that have name recognition. But again, this is 74 episodes in, so it's been a very long road. And a lot of that has been because of personal relationships over the years, where you can, call on someone to kind of try to bypass their team, because teams slow things up. If you're able to bypass the team and get to the artist, it's so much easier. But yeah, so those are some of the things that we're doing and hope to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Sia. Wow, lots of really insightful information from everyone. Thank you all for these wonderful presentations. So now we are moving to the discussion parts of the panel. So I have a few questions to ask, and at any point, all the panelists, please feel free to comment and ask questions. So let's see. Kim, I'm going to start with you again. So let's see here. So you said, Kim, in your presentation that most of the podcasts are produced by women, and there's more of an inclination for women in Egypt to choose podcasting as a platform. Could you perhaps tell us why that is, or why more women are choosing podcasting than men?
I don't know that I have stats that speak to that. I just know, and I think my perspective is coming from my university experience, and a lot of my students are women, young women. And again, they've expressed their interest in learning more about podcasting and doing more audio related content. And so I've been really, just trying to coach them through the process and helping them secure jobs working in audio in the Middle East. So that's where we can also see a lot of growth, that there are companies that are starting, and there are positions out there that are audio only. And some of them pay pretty decent salaries. So it's very impressive to be a part of that movement in Cairo and throughout Northern Africa and in parts of the Middle East as well. Mm-hmm. So just trying to make sure that, my young women podcasters have the resources. And so whether that is, getting them a chance to speak in front of a variety of audiences, Sia mentioned the language, because we do some podcasts in Arabic. This is my university challenge, that our students are, and I know they don't consider this disrespectful, but they are mediocre at English and Arabic, which does not work to their advantage. So I'm trying to get them to do more Arabic so that they can improve on that front, because the Arabic content is needed in the podcasting ecosystem. We need this dominance of English podcast to be not as prevalent as it is. And so trying to, fight the battle of getting more French podcasts, more Arabic, more just different languages is a part of our battle as well. And I want to get them that experience of speaking in Arabic, speaking in front of different audiences. So we're often trying to do trainings to help other people learn about the thing that we already know about. So just giving them the opportunity to share their skills and their knowledge with other people. Yeah.
Great. Can you tell me, Kim, also about the importance of introducing podcasting in Egypt, or I guess advocating for podcasting as a platform? I know you and I, when we worked on our paper together, and we realized, of course, how women were using podcasting as a platform to talk about their feminist perspectives, and they did it unintentionally, as we came to see in our research. So could you talk to me about the importance of introducing or advocating for podcasting in our region, and specifically Egypt?
Yeah, it's that digital feminism, it's the cyber activism that's really important. And you know that Egypt, it's like 10 years out of the January 25 revolution. So, you know, it's still kind of tricky when we're talking about people being silenced. And I hear some people talk about, hey, let's censor podcasts, or let's, regulate podcasting. And it's so disheartening to hear that, because I'm like, yeah, this is the last free, this is the prairie is kind of open. And I love that about it. And I really don't want to see, the government trying to get in here, even though we do see the abuse. Something like the far right is what they're doing in the US. But I really like podcasts for being that sort of niche thing that we can be in our enclave, and we can really, cultivate an environment where women feel comfortable talking to other women about concerns that they have, that we can try to, break down this patriarchy that exists. And I think that's what, our young female podcasters were trying to do. They're like, look, I see what's happening in my community. I see what's happening, in the country where I live. And how do I fight back? Like, this is a vehicle for, having a voice, having a say. And that's why I kind of look at this, and I want to take my female podcasters, like, how do we give back? How can we get to a younger generation who are really excited about podcasts? And how do we use this as a tool to enable them to, speak up for the things that they feel strongly about?
I love how you described it as a vehicle, but it absolutely is.
Yeah, thank you, Yas.
Thank you, Kim. If any of the other panelists want to ask Kim any questions, go for it. If not, Dr. Clark, I have a few questions. Dr. Jones, I have a few questions for you. Let's see. So how has podcasting served as a form of public scholarship? And what do you mean by it? Could you elaborate on public, please?
Yes, that's a really great question. So our public, as I alluded to, we really conceive of as the global Africa. Our focus is on Black people, African descendant people, wherever they may be. In terms of public scholarship and what it is we're able to produce through the podcast, it really comes from like a lens of understanding that knowledge is not just something produced in the Western Academy, or something that's produced in an academy, period. That knowledge is something that comes from our traditions, it comes from our bodies, it comes from our ancestors, and that we need to continue to carve out spaces that recognize these different forms of knowledge and how they are produced, especially how knowledge is produced within a collective and within a very geographically spread public, that the global Africa is a public within itself. We are the largest public. We are the global majority. We might be minorities in some parts of the world, but we are indeed the global majority. So our public is the global majority. And beyond thinking about just what knowledge is and how knowledge is produced, having a specific audience of policy folks that engage in tech. We see the harms and we know the harms that artificial intelligence can reproduce because different forms of knowledge have not been included in its design. So if you think of something as simple as the way cameras were created and how they're interacting with light and with different skin tones, Black people aren't seen in some forms of capture with visual production, and that these kinds of technologies are embedded in artificial intelligences, which yield tremendous medical, bioethical impacts on people of color. And so not having the voices and perspectives of African and African descended people in these conversations about tech, what you end up thinking about is, okay, we have self-driving cars that don't see darker skin tones. Well, that's probably not a good idea. And so until people are listening and until our own public is aware of really the very serious nature of what technology means for our lives, our health, our ability to function optimally in this world, we're not even going to have a fighting chance of getting policies to shift and adjust to consider what our needs are. And beyond just getting a seat at the table and being heard, really about creating the solutions for ourselves, identifying those of us who are already doing the work to bring about these solutions, identifying the engineers and the artists and the people who have their feet on the ground and their hands in it, and who are doing that work, and finding ways to give them a broader platform so that we can all be part of what it means to build the kind of world that that respects our humanity.
Right, and I love that you said, obviously, diverse, you included diverse people with diverse professions. It's not just journalists who are doing podcasts, it's everyone, right?
It's everyone.
Exactly, that's awesome. Okay, next question also for you, Dr. Jones. In what ways does the podcast help A1 for Africa reach its goals?
Yeah, so I outlined some of the goals of AI for Africa, namely, though, I think the point that we're just coming off of is to really insert African perspectives, and when into tech discourses. So when I spoke in the presentation about how we do the podcast and then we'll hold a follow-up Clubhouse discussion. Clubhouse is a very intentional medium. There are so many tech folks on Clubhouse. There are African tech Clubhouse groups. So we can talk to our folks on the continent with our folks on the continent who are in different places and really get into some of the really key issues in those spaces without having to be like, race is important, race is important. Then we go to the tech groups that are primarily white, and over there we just say, race is important, but we get to have the discussions with different people, and we can say, go back to our podcast to understand some of the more nuanced and in-depth ideas that are being discussed there. I'd say secondly that our approach to developing our podcast and the approach of AI for Africa overall is really rooted in African and indigenous ancestral knowledge. So we abide by Ubuntu philosophies, and that we are all human because of each other, that we are able to recognize our humanity because we see ourselves in other people, almost to the point where there actually is no other. It's I am because we are. And so from that mindset, if we can create a shift for how people understand humanity, for how they understand themselves as being a human only because they see that reflection within other human beings, that is really what we're trying to accomplish through the podcast, is to create this space where people feel like they can be. There's really not another way to say that. There's a place where they can be fully human, and sit with that. Knowledge is not just something that comes from the head. That's a very Western way of thinking about things, but knowledge and the ways that we ought to be living in this world come from our totality and from the ways that we engage with our land, with our ancestors, with our spirit, with each other as a whole. So that is probably our bigger goal, is the philosophy that we believe that we should be operating in this world. And we hope that our listeners can tap into that, can feel that, and can see themselves as part of a more Ubuntu framework for how to live this life.
I love that. We see ourselves in other people. I'm going to remember that. Okay, one more question. So can you talk about the response of those on the African continent and those in the diaspora? Have they differed, and who is the primary audience?
Yeah, now that one's rough. Okay, I don't have all the data. Anatola is the one who has that. And I could have gotten it from her, but I will tell you, since we're very new, it's not a lot of data yet for us anyway. Anatola does the production work from California. I do my finding folks and curating the podcast from Maryland. But I lean on that big group of founders primarily that I shared in the beginning, who are literally all over the world, in Africa as well as the diaspora. And then our podcast is edited in Ghana by another of our members. So it's really a truly global Africa project. Those things I want to flag because those key players impact who the listeners become. Because if you are invested in creating something, you're going to be invested in sharing it. And so as soon as we record a podcast, we send it out to our WhatsApp chat for our AI for Africa members. And we're like, we recorded it, check it out. If Anatola gets it out in the middle of the night in the US, well, that's perfect, because our folks in West Africa are waking up. And so they might be the first to listen to it and share it earlier in the day. And so we're not really sure where we're getting most of our listeners at this point, because it really has varied from episode to episode based on who the main speakers were. However, we have this ongoing tension when we host the Clubhouse groups, because it's so hard to choose the time to hold them because of the different places where people are located. So that is an ongoing point of productive tension, is always just being aware that if we truly are about being inclusive and being this global Africa, that sometimes you have to get up at 4 a.m., not because you're in Africa, but because you're in the US. And that's just what it is. African things should be done on African time. So it's always a negotiation and finding better ways to engage everyone. Podcasts are helpful for that, though, because they can be listened to asynchronously. So that, I mean, it's an ongoing struggle, and we don't really have the data yet because we're super new. We've only done this over probably the past 4 to 5 months. So we don't have a lot yet, but we're growing it out. We're developing it with those points in mind, that we always have to be mindful of the inherent power dynamics of being in different parts of the world with our people all over.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Jones. And I look forward to listening to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so next, Melissa, I have a question for you. So let's see. Could you perhaps elaborate on the potential growth opportunity that lies in underrepresented voices?
That's the most exciting. Well, like it's the challenge with media, which is also, why this conference exists and why we're, the work that we all do in this room. So we can look at it as a challenge, which it is, but it's also the opportunity for, growth and true cultural expression, defining what our culture could become, but also for economic development. Because there's so much opportunity within the audio industry as part of the creative and cultural industries, with the fact that most people on the continent are young, women, children, like literally the same groups that we are seeing are taking to podcasting and that are leading the way as podcasters, but also as audiences, because they're just finding themselves, unserved by the existing media. So it's pretty exciting from the perspective of also being able to literally redefine what the future of the media industry could look like from a developmental perspective as well. And for us at Africa Podfest, we truly do believe that for this to building it inclusively at the core is the only way to do it right. So it's literally not even a marginal perspective. It's only a left idea conceptually, but when you look at what's going on even anecdotally, and the more data we gather, the more people we meet, the more stories we hear, the more the evidence tells us that actually having women at the forefront, having young people at the forefront, making podcasts, making content for the people who you'd think or who typically are thought of as audiences who are in the margins, is actually how to grow successfully in media in Africa. And we tell this when we're speaking to, for example, like mainstream media players or even technology players in the podcast space. And it's interesting because it's often kind of received as a counterintuitive. It seems counterintuitive, but I love the conversation in this room because every project that's been spoken about and everybody who's really doing amazing work in this room is literally can see this opportunity and is working to develop this. So I think for us at Africa Podfest, our commitment and my commitment and what's exciting about this for me at an individual level is just to continue to tell the story about the opportunity just by surfacing the data about what's going on, the stories, and connecting the people who are making this reality even more real, just by expanding and continuing to grow and succeed and be able to share the success stories with the world.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you. So yeah, underrepresented voices offer us the opportunity to perhaps redefine the profession. That's awesome. Okay, anybody have any questions for Melissa from any panelists? Okay, next question is for Jidi. Okay, so my question for you, Jidi, is, can podcasts be a solution to the current lack of trust in journalism?
Thank you, Yasmeen. Yes, absolutely. I think it's becoming almost the alternative to the mainstream. I think now, as you've seen with the pandemic flow of information, COVID-19, and also corporate interest in the established media means that sometimes the truth gets hidden or is not exposed. And also when it comes to the radio space, which is sort of like where I naturally transitioned into podcasting, space and time are very important things and costly and can be very expensive. As a radio journalist, you really don't have that luxury of producing a 30-minute documentary that will be broadcast on a national radio station. That's just not possible. So the podcasting space then provides that opportunity for journalists who want to do a lot more immersive journalism and tell more narrative stories that really look beyond the surface of the headlines and bring out all of these marginalized voices that could be lost in the mainstream. This is where we want to position ourselves. And because of the low barriers of entry into the industry, as in it's much easier to do than the process of producing a podcast would be much easier of a audio documentary, would be much easier in a podcasting space than in say the SABC, for example, or any other national broadcaster. So it is absolutely an option. And it also means that, people who listen to podcasts can get an array of perspectives, especially if you're doing narrative and immersive type of journalism. Because the mainstream, you get clips and short sound bites, and the context is often very lost. And I think that's what's needed in journalism globally. And I think the podcasting sphere is where it is most likely to happen and happen successfully.
Okay. You also talked about how, Africans rely mainly on foreign media to get their news or as credible news sources. Why do you think that is?
I don't know, maybe colonialism, first of all. But I think, there are many reasons, a lack of democratic states in the country, for example, and in many African states, we haven't actually reached mature democracies, meaning the freedom of expression is not always possible in those spaces, and journalism are facing, harassment, assault, jail time for telling the truth. So the external forces then become like the only option. But also it just means that there isn't enough investment within our national broadcasters because the issue is mostly about cross-border reporting about, South Africa reporting about events happening in Kenya, or Kenya reporting about events happening in Nigeria. There isn't much of that. So there are two things: there's political will, and there's just the way our governments and the democratic space, whether it allows that to happen or not. And there's also other issues, I think. But yeah, I think those would be probably the two most prominent reasons why people would go to the BBC instead of the SABC to find out what's happening on the continent, But of course, we need to change our mindsets and our value systems. So if we still think that the West are better, or the Western media houses are better, well-resourced, they will provide more accurate information, then this is likely to continue. But if we can think that we are also, we can find the resources to tell our stories, and we are the credible sources of those stories too, because, it's not like they interview people in Europe. They interview Africans in Africa, but all of that information is with the BBC and not on the continent. So yeah, I think those are the reasons. I'm sure there are many others as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Like Kim was mentioning earlier, in terms of censorship, we have the same problem here in Egypt. There are some things we just can't report on. But anyway, I'll end on that. Do you guys have any other questions, panelists? If not, we can proceed to the questions from our audience. So we can start looking at those if you guys are okay with that. Yeah, okay. So I'm just gonna scroll in the chat up here really quickly. Make sure I don't miss anyone.
Yasmeen, while you're looking, can I throw out one question?
Yes, please.
And this blends my own interest as a researcher and as a creator. How are you reckoning with your own position as often the people who are the voice of your podcast or have some impact there with the actual story? How are you just recognizing the role that you play and the power dynamics of what's created because of who you are and the topics that you're choosing to address, particularly as African women?
I nominate Msia to go first.
So that's a great question. I know that for me, I do see my work is in the podcast, especially as a form of activism. Because it's really intentionally dealing with specific issues. Especially when we are talking to queer artists who may have left their country because of the laws there. And so I think that like I said earlier, I try to, even though I'm the host of the show, that tendency to switch the focus and keep it on the artist and keep it on the subject, and rather than myself. And so I think that's kind of a way to try to let the artist speak for themselves, let the story speak for itself. So it's a different style of podcast, I think, with the interview style versus the narrative style. But yeah, for me, I've looked at it as a form of activism and just kind of really wanting to present the artists on this platform to speak on these certain issues rather than kind of my own self inserting myself into it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Msia. I just want to jump in there with this quick, well, I don't know if it's a quick response, because, I'm in this awkward position. I'm an American living in Egypt, so I'm a bit of a foreigner, but I have this expertise in radio, podcasting, audio. And so I am, really playing this with this dynamic of, I'm trying to introduce podcasting to a space that doesn't really do podcasts, and how do we grow that community without centering myself? Even though, like I said, like technically we've been doing podcasts since 2009 when I arrived. So I do have a wealth of experience, not just here in Egypt, but my life prior to arriving in Egypt. And so I definitely tried to decenter myself, but then I have to check myself. I'm like, this is what I do. So, how do I, position that? And what I've been able to do is, again, just acquiesce and make sure I'm giving my young female students that opportunity to shine. So I'm still taking my opportunity to say, look, I'm your coach, and here's what I would like for you to do. Like my current TA, I did hire her for my podcast. She's the only one who gets paid, and I pay her out of my pocket as the assistant producer. And I'm like, look, this is how you do it. Like, because you know why I do that? Because I want her to go out and do her own thing. And I want her to see how it's done professionally. But in the end, for me, it's just conscientiously saying, like, look, I have to decenter myself, even though I have the knowledge base. And in that regard, I am the center. It's just a really tough dynamic. The same thing happens when I'm trying to do Arabic content. Again, Arabic is not my first language, a little bit of Arabic. And so I really have to hire Arabic editors who know my vision so that they can then make sure it shows up in the podcast. So it's just a really tough dynamic to play around with. But I grapple with it like on a regular basis. Anyone else?
Doesn't look like it. Okay, let's perhaps look at some of these questions, and hopefully we can get to all of them. Okay. So the first question here is from Natasha. So Natasha's asking, I have a growing desire to start podcasting, but I keep wondering if I have the voice for it or the personality for it. But what does it really take to be an appealing podcaster? So this is a question for everyone. So, okay, experts.
I did drop a response in the chat. Oh, but I'm sorry. And I'll just say shortly. No, it's fine. So I'll just say shortly, based on that response, that your voice is extremely important if you will be the person speaking. But there are also, like, you can create a soundscape, like the other sounds of the environment and the places where you are and the voices of other people, depending on what you want to create. And I think that JD gave some phenomenal examples because they're using a documentary style, that you don't only have to rely on if you like the quality of your own voice on a podcast. So do consider other creative ways to make something that you feel really good about, that maybe lifts other types of sounds and other people's voices in a different way.
Thank you, Dr. Jones.
I'll also add that, practice, like start now in, like record your voice on your voice notes on your phone. Just practice kind of telling the story in different styles, adding the soundscape, for example, and just send it to, like your few people who can give you feedback. But practice, just like start in small ways. You don't have to kind of dive into the deep end if you feel like you still need to, hone your speaking, your diction. There's tools as well. There are tools that can help you like practice. You literally will become better at podcasting as you do it. So a lot of podcasters say that their first episode, when they listen to it later on, they're like cringing. But the only way to do it is to begin.
All right, thank you, Melissa. Anybody else? Okay. All right.
I would say, sorry, coming from, okay. Yeah, coming from a radio background, I mean, I was told as a journalist that you can't be a radio journalist if you don't have a great voice. And in the industry, people would take up smoking, especially women with thin voices, to try and make, the voice much more thicker and more engaging. But I think a quick way of really gaining confidence, I think, when you're podcasting is to talk about things that A, you know about, and B, that you're passionate about. And then also imagine someone who you respect and who likes you. Imagine that you're talking to them because you're more likely to be relaxed and you want them to get the core of the information and add passion. So I think for the first timers, just think of those. And then obviously there are voice training lessons that you can get online that are free and practice as well.
Excellent advice from everyone. Thank you. Great. Okay, let's move to the next question from Mercy Frank. Mercy began her career in media through podcasting in 2013. And she's saying from experience, she has observed that Africans in the continent are more drawn to visual platforms like YouTube. So she's asking, how can one make podcasts grow even with the video platforms as competition? And what are the likely topics that you think Africans are more drawn to? So, yeah, and this is not for any specific speaker.
That's an interesting question that actually comes up quite a lot in like podcaster gatherings. One, radio is still the king of media in Africa, king and queen. So radio is still huge, which means we are still audio people. It's just that in the digital space, podcasting is the latest cool kid on the block and already found like YouTube video platforms existing. And also YouTube, the company Google has invested technologically in making YouTube more accessible. Like you don't need as much data, for example, to like be able to access YouTube videos and so on. So it's just easier for the audience currently online to access video, but that doesn't by any means say that is not conclusive. I'd say like it doesn't mean that your podcast would not succeed and that you wouldn't find an audience, because surprisingly, a lot of the podcasters who are successful, even by audience numbers, some of the most popular ones, like in the slide that Jedi shared, the most popular podcasts, those all, they're like 2-3 years old, those podcasts, and yet they have listeners in the hundreds of thousands, if not more. So it's really not fixed, and your experimentation is kind of what will show you, which is the advantage of being early, is that you get to the freedom to experiment and to also teach the audience something new. The downside is that you have to invest in, teaching the audience, which costs you more time and effort. And you have to invest more in like your stretch yourself creatively and so on. There is no manual essentially. But the format, I'll just say like, and I think this came up as well with one of the other speakers, in terms of format of podcasts, we really haven't yet even begun to like scratch the surface in African podcasting. We're still mostly doing like interview style, barely doing narrative style. Sound Africa is like, being a production company, is focusing on like going deeper into different styles, which do cost more in terms of creative energy, resources, time, but literally the field is open, is what I'll say about this.
Yeah, I want to build on what Melissa was saying in terms of the audio landscape, because we have seen how Clubhouse just took off during the pandemic. And that is a huge sign of what's possible. And of course, Jasmine knows that with the success they're having with their podcast on Clubhouse. And of course, as we've seen those podcasts, those platforms grow. So Clubhouse, Twitter Spaces, and there are a few others out there. And the point is, even with the social audio is what they're being called. Social audio, now they want to say, hey, like they're sort of doing live radio, right? But now they want to be able to like, hey, I want to capture that, because things are happening in real time and it's just like, it just goes away. It's like, no, we want to document these conversations. And so that's when we want to repurpose that content into a podcast maybe take an hour-long discussion, edit it down to maybe 20, 30 minutes or something like that. So we definitely have a lot of growth in audio. And in terms of video, there are a couple of platforms that are out there. Squadcast is one of them, and Riverside FM is another. I haven't used them, but they both operate on the premise of doing your podcast with that video component, because there are audiences out there, for that, that would really like to have that option of seeing people in action. So yeah, I would just say play around with your options, look out there and see who else is doing, say, with a video podcast. What are they doing with YouTube? Because YouTube does have some, or they did have some restrictions on, you just can't pop the audio in with a graphic. We want to have something a little bit more interactive, and probably multiple graphics would make it a little bit more than just saying, looking at a single graphic for 30 minutes. So just try to think about, breaking the template. This is what I love about podcasting. It really is about disruption. And especially, and we talked about this in that article that I posted, Africa can't really duplicate what Western, the Western podcasting communities are doing, for a number of reasons. So we need to just disrupt this entire thing and don't try to duplicate what's out there, but do what you feel comfortable doing. And that often won't look like something that already exists, and that's okay.
Thank you, Kim.
Yeah, I would like to also add on to that and say that from a Sound Africa perspective, we've tried to partner with, other local radio stations. Like more recently, we partnered with a community radio station in Mukuru, that's in Kenya, who were willing to air our entire series called Think African. And that's also one way of getting more people aware that there are podcasts, there are other places where they can listen to radio type stories on the internet. And so that's one way that we've tried to make it more, to make it grow. But I also think another thing that we often forget as creators is we are in these silos, and we're not fully aware of the fact that at least 70% of the continent still does not have access to the internet. And also on the continent, we're having problems with power and electricity. So sometimes, even if you might want to have these long podcasts like we do at Sound Africa, people don't have enough data or electricity, Wi-Fi, or power to stay on. I'm not sure why the videos are more successful. Maybe it's because they've been around for much longer, or people have been aware of them for much longer. But I still think that infrastructure problems are still a barrier for access and also for consumption of podcasts. Some of our women podcasters often talk about having to reduce the quality of their podcasts, make them shorter, make them even instead of having a long 2-hour or 3-hour podcast like Joe Rogan does, have it in really, really small clips. So I agree with the other panelists that we really have to be much more creative in how we approach it. But it also means that there are opportunities for engineers and others who can then help push us further into, growth or whatever.
Do we have any other questions at the moment?
It doesn't, not on the chat, no.
I have a question for Sia, if you don't mind me asking for the
Yes.
moment. Sia, you mentioned something about tracking, and I'm wondering what you're utilizing to sort of track, I think, listenership.
My hosting site is WordPress. And so I'm looking at the stats on WordPress. I know that there are, podcasting apps or other platforms that actually provide better breakdowns. WordPress's breakdown is not that great, but it does break it down by country. And, you're able to, and then also kind of the traffic, the source of the traffic. So you're able to see what website clicked on your link and then what words they search for in, search engines. So that's what I've been using.
Great, especially because
I
you've
do
been
want
doing it
to
so long.
say some things real quick. I know that in terms of the file sizes also to kind of keep in mind, because that was one of the things I had to, again, watching tutorials to figure out how to reduce the file size without reducing quality. Because sometimes I think the default recording settings have these really big file sizes, but keeping in mind if people are streaming, especially on the continent, I had to learn how, especially since mine is mostly interviews, so I don't have a whole bunch of music and all that. So like learning the settings so that you can reduce file size also helps other people download it.
Okay, any other questions?
Mercy
Looks like
raised her hand.
Mercy has a question. Okay, Mercy, you can go ahead and ask.
All right. Sorry. I think it's a whole lot better for me to speak than type. I'm having Zoom fatigue right now, and it's not funny. But anyway, it's a very interesting subject matter. I absolutely love podcasting. As I mentioned, it was my start into media. I'm really crazy about it. So one thing I think that we probably might be forgetting to talk about is monetizing podcast. I mean, I don't know who mentioned Joe Rogan. I see the amount of adverts he has, and you could have 5 minutes straight of all adverts, and people are not even, turning their heads away, despite the fact that his own style of podcasting is very controversial and he does a lot of swear words and the rest of them. But people are hooked. So in Africa, where people rather listen to the radio for free, watch YouTube videos for free, than pay to listen to a podcast. How do we manage it? Because at some point, your passion will need to be sustained, and that's where money comes into play. So I don't know if anybody here has been able to successfully do the monetization of podcasts and how we can get to, I know we are growing, but we need to start having this kind of conversations right now if we want podcasts to thrive in the continent. Thank you.
Well, I can jump in right quick because I've already put my comment in the chat. I really think it's just about being creative, Mercy. You've got to examine what's happening in your community, and you need to look at what the entrepreneurs are doing. It's going to take some creativity, especially because we're looking at platforms like a WhatsApp. A lot of podcasters in the US are using Patreon. That doesn't work for us. So, what can we do? Of course, you can say, well, maybe I do have listeners outside of the continent where they can use that platform, and that's great. But that means you're probably using, again, multiple sources of monetization and not just one. And that's why I said in the chat that we can't really duplicate what the Westerners are doing. And it's just going to take a little bit of creativity to figure out what's going to work for you. It's the challenge that everyone wants to get into, because some people are saying, I'm putting all this money and time into this podcast. How do I get something coming back to me? And I think for me, I have to think about, like, what do I really want back? And does it have to come in the form of money?
Are you calling my name?
Are you talking to me, Msia?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so
Like, I can call your name.
No, I was talking to my son and I accidentally unmuted. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's all right. No, I think that wraps it up, though, just trying to figure out creative ways. And I think maybe we need to have a hackathon to say, hey, what's possible in Africa? Maybe we can hook up with Jasmine and her team at AI for Africa to say, like, hey, how do we monetize this thing? We've got to get more creative, and we can't keep looking at, again, Western examples as the thing that we can duplicate, because we've already talked about how we are not comparable to what Westerners are doing in podcasting. And especially if you mention Joe Rogan, like, Joe Rogan he's just out there. And frankly speaking, I don't want to duplicate what Rogan is doing. I do really like the nicheness of podcasting, and I'm really anxious to see how people, here's what I really want. Here's my wish list. I really want us in Africa to do something like that just blows everyone else away in terms of monetization. I want them to look to us to be the model for monetization. That is my dream.
Yeah, if I could
May
still-
I come in?
Yes.
Okay. I guess I have been getting feedbacks, not just feedbacks, but I have monetized my podcast. And what worked for me, which first of all, my podcast is not so big. I started in I'm not sure I am more than 2 months old, but I'm able to start getting money, even though it's not quite much yet. But what works for me or has been working is I moved my influence from Facebook back to my podcast. That's first. And then secondly, I also asked my friends that are vendors to give like a discount for people buying from my podcast. And then so there's like a promo code, like my podcast is Unzipped Stories. So I tell them, okay, so let's make like an agreement. I would make an advertisement on my podcast with your business, and then you pay me a certain amount, but then more importantly to me is give my audience discount. So when I did that, even before I started placing the ads, because I've not released any of the podcast that has ads on it yet. But even before then, I had a number of vendors who actually registered. So what I did was like do more of like a subscription. So you pay in a certain amount, and then it runs for this number of months, and number of podcast episodes. And if you're not comfortable at any point, just let me know. Just let me know if you're getting, because on my own part, I need to track if those people advertising on my podcast are getting money or not. So we have that as part of the agreement. But right now, I already have like 5 vendors who have registered with me. And so that's like one way of getting money, because I've set up a TV station before right here in Abuja. And so part of the challenges that we had was trying to get people to invest in TV advertisement. So I kind of took the model of trying to find people who invest on TV advertisement and take it down to the podcast level. And I'm glad with the feed so far. To think that I only have 7 episodes released already. I have just 7 episodes, but to think that within the 7 episodes, I've been able to have like over 1,000 listeners and almost 500 people coming back to listen. Almost 500, over 533 people coming back to listen, and I have like a retainer of 240, I can't remember, but over just slightly above 200 people who come in, like who have listened to almost all the episodes I've released. So I just think that we have to also be very creative about that. Like explore all the measures available to us. And also, I've also realized that your connections with other African countries also has a level of boosting. For instance, if I mention to people, come on my podcast, I'm currently recording a guest from Zambia, for instance, kind of boosts the level of credibility, and people want to just get involved and get engaged with what you're doing, because now they know that, especially the entrepreneurs that are coming on your platform, because now they know that whatever they send to your platform is not just localized to your country of origin, but has the potential of reaching people even outside your country of origin. Okay, I feel I'm talking too much. I hope this makes sense.
I just want to say something in terms of the monetization. We, aren't monetizing, but I do think that if it was easy, too many people would be podcasting because it's, if it doing it just for the money, I think, and yeah. So I think you can always, apply for grants. I know it's not always possible depending on where you are, but a lot of international organizations, depending on the topic, may be receptive to grant applications. But I also feel like if you invest in it and you are really kind of good at it and really have a good content, people will come to you. So we've had people who have asked us to feature artists that they were managers or publicists to feature artists that are their clients. We've had people offer to pay to post things. An offer for advertisements, and that's because that wasn't in the first year or two. This was like 3 years in when we started getting offers. So I do think that once you establish, because a lot of podcasts will, like some of us, you go on the podcast platforms and you'll see a podcast maybe had 2 episodes in 2018, an episode in 2020, and then nothing. And so you need to kind of establish that this is something that you're going to be doing and that they invest in you, that this is something that so just kind of thinking of it might take a while, but if you kind of keep with it and have good content, then it'll be easier for you to get that kind of advertising or monetization.
Thank you, Sia. Okay, we only have a few more minutes left for final questions. We actually have about 3 more minutes left for final questions. So if anybody else has any more questions, now's the time. Let's see, let's look at our chat here real quick.
While you're doing that, I just want to also say our School of Communication at Howard University, they just actually they're hiring someone, an assistant professor, tenure track position. I posted it in the job posting on the app. I'm not in that department. I have nothing to do with that. I don't know anything about it, but when I saw it, because our School of Communications does deal with, radio, broadcasting, all of that. So people who are interested should look at it, and then of course share it.
Excellent, thank you.
Trying to lure me back to the US.
Well, we've got Nicole Hannah-Jones at the School of Communication now, and so
that is attractive for sure.
Definitely.
Cryptocurrency, Jasmine, please elaborate. And I think you're talking about NFTs as well. Does that fall into that bracket?
So one of the things I've been experimenting with and that I've seen happen a lot in the Clubhouse space is that people, when they hold their various rooms and places where there are discussions ongoing, will charge people a token, a cryptocurrency token, to publicize live their whatever it is they have going on. So if you're in a Clubhouse room and the topic is on the African diaspora and travel, and you want to hype your travel business, you can't just hop on in some people's rooms and be like, oh, I do this, blah, blah, blah. They're like, no, in this room, you contact us ahead of time, you pay your token, and then we give you that time and we support you and we hype you up and we give you that space to do that. And crypto is giving us so many options for how we can move money quickly across borders and boundaries from country to country in Africa, where our money is different, and getting money from one place to another has been a burden in the past in a lot of ways. It gives us a way in this digital space, since we're creating digital products, to get money moving and to find other ways to support the work we're doing. We're not looking at monetizing our stuff yet, so we haven't experimented with that. But I do think that if we were moving in that direction, that our group would obviously, we look at AI, that's our area. We would obviously use some of these newer models of currency exchange. So I do encourage us to think about how that might work better for us.
Definitely. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Okay, anybody else?
Yeah, I'd just like to add one last thing that, podcasting is not just about being on the radio yourself. There are lots of other roles that you can play in the podcasting ecosystem that can help you to then make money. Because a lot of podcasters that are coming out there, they don't really know how to edit sound or edit it correctly. There's graphics, there's music, there's editing, there's transcription, translations. So there's so many other ways that you can sort of get the cash that could help to sustain your business. And I didn't mention that most of the people that are podcasting in Africa, at least within my group, all have full-time jobs in addition to their podcast. So don't quit your day job just yet. So and then find other ways to build up the resources to do it. So most people really within the African space are using podcasts as a way of expanding their brand, showcasing their services, promoting their businesses as well as. So I think selling merchandise, there's so many of those things that are happening, but also there's a lot of work in the background, and we don't have enough of people in the background. We don't have enough editors, even voice actors as well. That's also an area that you could look into. You don't have to make one, but you can narrate someone else's podcast, for example.
I know this isn't the focus, but your comments really just took me somewhere with the don't quit your day job. And that's real, but I really want to push us on these divisions of different parts of our life that we think are so crucial. Some of us love our day jobs too, and there are ways to blend and mix and pull together what it is we're good at, what it is that pays us with what it is that we love, and ways that we can use the ways we've established ourselves in different fields as experts in a certain area to advance the work that we're doing in this podcasting space. So for people who are just getting started, or people who feel just really burdened because you've been trying to do multiple things that feel so segmented, think about how you might pull things together in a way that feels more fully you, and that lets you do work that's more cohesive. And that's why I asked about like how we are individually showing up within the space where we're telling sometimes other people's stories, how much of us is there? Because that's a reality. Like we say that research and science is objective, but it's not, because we all see the world from a particular view. And that shows up in our journalism and our media making and our podcasting. At the same time, since it shows up anyway, let's just tell the truth about it. Be like, I'm a researcher, so when I approach this podcast space, this is what I'm bringing with me. I understand humanity in this kind of way because these are the things I'm concerned about. So when I'm curating, I'm bringing in people who are talking about these kinds of things. And just know that when you come to this podcast space, that's what you're going to get. And I think that for me has just made it easier to navigate without feeling like it's always a push and pull and a rejection of what is important to me in service of something else or something outside of myself. So I just really encourage you to just pull it all together, be fully you, and do that thing, integrate it, and rely on your village, us, and whoever else you're working with.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. What a way to end the panel. Thank you. That is so awesome. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you to all the panelists. I hate that we are running out of time, so we have only 2 minutes left. So if any of the panelists have some final remarks, go for it. If not, we're going to have to end the panel.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to African women in media for having us and letting us have this panel. It's great. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Kim. All right, thank you all so much. I believe there's the final, the closing remarks is starting soon. So if any of you want to attend that, I think it's starting, at 6, I believe. But yeah, thank you again, everyone. And yeah, take care. And hopefully I'll see you guys soon. Bye.